Our next speaker is going to really attack issues kind of at the end of the 20th century. Because one of the big shifts that people are talking about now is the big shift that has happened to the way we think about art, the way we think about culture in the digital age. Almost everything that we've talked about so far in the last 2 days has been completely revolutionized through the advent of digital technology, both for what artists are doing, but also for what we are doing as academics, as humanists, as art historians, the way we approach the archive, the way that we approach the past. And this, I believe, is going to be, here's my way into Meredith's talk. But to introduce her, we're ecstatic to have Merideth Hoy with us. Meredith is assistant professor of art history and theory at the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts at Arizona State University. So she's the least jet-lagged of all the speakers. She doesn't have that excuse. Her research focuses on contemporary art and architecture, especially on the impact of technology on art. She has written widely on these topics, and her recent book is called From Point to Pixel, A Genealogy of Digital Aesthetics, which was published this year. So keep an eye out for that one. Meredith, on to you.
Hi, everyone. I seem to be at this opportune moment losing my voice. And I'm really bad with microphones. So this is just like throw Rotten Tomatoes at me or something if you can't hear me. So, what's that? Right, I do. Or a bald eagle. That would be better. Oh, no, I'm fine. Yeah, so first, obviously, I would love to thank our illustrious organizers, James and Vid. The story of how I got here, basically, is that Vid unearthed my as-yet published dissertation out of the far corners of the interwebs. I don't even know how we found it. But and wrote me an email and said, well, can I use this for a reading group? And I said, well, yeah, if you dare. And, then he invited me to this, and it's just been such a delightful experience. I mean, really, the highlight of my year, actually, to be in this company of such impressive but also fun scholars. I haven't laughed this hard in I don't know how long. And thanks so much also to Karun. You've just been so generous with your time and your impressive energy, and the tour that you gave us was so terrific. So, and the other things that you've organized for us have been amazing. So, yeah, that's my thank you, and thank you all for being here. Of course. So my presentation today consists of a series of probably somewhat fragmentary impressions and oh my god. Jeez, sound like a horrible smoker or something. I don't know. So somewhat probably fragmentary impressions that ultimately will be pieced together into what I think will be one book. First I thought it was maybe 2 books, but now everything's kind of entangling, so I don't know. And I will possibly, to some of your chagrin, be moving in the direction of the non-visual turn, which is happening in certain trends or branches of media studies, and particularly media archaeology, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. This very, very sort of abstract theoretical approach is, of course, not endemic to the field. So, for example, if you want further reading, there's a scholar named Erkki Huhtamo, who takes a microscopic lens to the sort of relatively brief life and then legacy of the moving panorama, which is a visual spectacle that's basically been suppressed in art historical research for interesting reasons. So there's very, very kind of visually and materially specific work out there. So my paper, despite the title of this conference forum, does not actually talk about art at all. I don't think I mentioned one piece of art. Maybe I will in passing. So it's really about the structure of knowledge, though, and the structure of memory that has been changed and is driven by digital systems and specifically digital stored memory. And the inherent and of course very apparent implications across cultural practices and into the art world that these changes have. So I've been kind of working on this paper as I've been here, and I've had some great discussions. So I built some of these discussions into what I'm going to talk about today. And to begin, I had a very lively discussion with Karun about the use or usefulness of theory, which sort of drew me into a meditation of how my own research and writing takes a stance on the significance of theory to the field of media studies. So one goal of this project sort of reflects upon my views about the aims of theory-driven research and writing through touching on topics that we know, the archive, memory, temporality, something I'm calling information ecology, which comes from my conviction that theory works to articulate potentialities about many, there are many potentialities about many things, but that's sort of what it does, right? It makes us think about something that we might not otherwise think of. So this project bears out that aim by looking at the multiple entanglements of art, technology, science, and philosophy, under the presupposition that a mutually constitutive relationship between techniques and culture provide the possibility conditions for historically and culturally specific world picture to come into view. So my work, which even before the sort of inception of media archaeology as a field, a subcategory of media studies came about, I sort of had I used this methodology. So sort of turned towards a very long view of normative assumptions and metamorphoses, cultural, technological, and so forth, that put pressure on existing epistemological frameworks. So between 1995, when Jacques Derrida published Archive Fever, and 2005, in which he published a collection of essays titled Paper Machine, Derrida launched an extended meditation on the figure of the archive and sort of how it's developed over time. So the archive traditionally is the central repository of, the accumulated records of human achievement, of human greatness, and is the consecrated gathering place of documents and artifacts that preside over the construction of historical narratives. And the archive itself holds the power to identify, organize, classify, and then enclose the traces of human activity, and then to kind of define the structure of knowledge, really, and the boundaries of knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and things like this. But new developments in digital technology have propelled these metamorphoses in the notion of the archive. So it was once a static and very monolithic construction, that canonized and preserved artifacts, which becomes, under these new conditions, something highly mutable, expandable, decentralized, and it's still, there's still a concern about storage and memory, but the way that this storage is achieved and the way that it changes notions of temporality is what I'm going to continue to look at. So let's see. What time did I start? 15 minutes in. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be cutting a lot. Jeez, I thought I was going to. I kept trying to expand it, thinking I didn't have enough. Go figure. So let's see. So, I'm going from the idea that the archive is a technology, right? Whether or not it is an architectural framework, or, a digital electronic computational, technology. And it is, in both cases, highly performative. In other words, it actually, sort of produces the way in which we think of or construct the notion of memory and of temporality. So not just in a metaphorical way, but in a kind of very actual way, and even in science, right? That it's digital paradigms have kind of reformulated the way that we think of neural networks and so on and so forth. So this restructuring of memory and temporality then undoes the project of the traditional archive, which is to render its artifacts and documents past, right? To locate these things in pastness, to kind of freeze them in time. And then in this new digital temporality, all objects of knowledge sort of turned into data, which are exponentially, increasing into big data and so forth, are reshuffled and accessed and sort of turned into an eternal present, right? So if it's digital memory is digital systems basically stay alive. They can, by continuously running and refreshing and keeping themselves going, and then in that case, disallowing themselves from becoming frozen or monolithic or monumental in the manner of the traditional archive. So I'm going to skip the part about media archaeology because you all did the reading about what media archaeology does. Just a couple of things. I mean, it does sort of oscillate between a rather technologically determinist point of view on media, the effects of technology, or the constitutive effects of technology on culture. So someone like a theorist like Kittler actually abrogates the human and culture from his close analyses of the sort of materiality of technological devices, and even sort of claims that human culture will reach its end, its demise. And then there's the other much more socially constructivist views, much like Hutamo's, in which culture and technology are sort of put more mutual pressure on each other. That the sort of technological horizons are enabled by the limits, the boundaries of the current cultural imagination. So the traditional archive, as I've already kind of mentioned, is stable, immobilized, monolithic, monumental, and is described through and sort of actualized through spatiality, and described through spatial metaphors, and realized as a spatial construction. So what happens to this notion of spatiality when you're talking about something that seems to be so immaterial as data, right? We think of it floating around this big cloud, and it's very difficult to connect data to any sort of concrete shape or form, right? But in fact, we know that there are certain metaphors that have been applied to interfaces, right? Like the desktop and the window, whatever, all these words that kind of signify this bureaucratic spatial organization. Social media platforms in which we as users sort of deposit our data, right? These are our data storage platforms, which are often described in spatial terms as gathering together, right? As creating a collection, Instagram, a collection of images. UC Parika, who is, of course, the author of the reading today, points to the shift in thinking about preservation away from spatial metaphors, though. So we have certain texts, certain theorists who are talking still in spatial terms. But Parika is shifting towards thinking about digital stored memory in terms of time, right? So away from the freezing of time that occurs in the traditional archive, and it sort of echoes the words of Robert Smithson, who speaks of the White Cube Museum as a mausoleum. So the archive is a mausoleum. The new digital archive as fracturing not only space, but the idea of temporal continuity, based on the fact that data can be recombined, right? That you can take data sets and or take sort of abstract data, organize it into data sets, visualize that data, and then recombine other data set, parts of that data, aspects of that data set into another data set. So there's this constant sort of reuse or even remix culture that comes about as a result of the kind of technological affordances of digital systems. Looking at things to skip. Digital stored memory is fundamentally based on process, on temporal operation, that renders the digital archive very vulnerable in a sense. It renders it vulnerable to rewriting, right, in the case of Wikipedia or something like this, to erasure, to data loss, through to technological obsolescence, right? So it's highly impermanent, where we think of the traditional archive as being very permanent, Library of Alexandria aside. The archive under the aegis of computational systems is really centered on this idea of mobility, dynamic connectivity, right? Sort of putting chains of data together to produce information, which is a legible strand, a legible message that is formed out of data. It's also about relationality and regrouping. So the unfreezing of time, the destruction of these sort of ossified, self-enclosed documents that are hidden away in traditional archives. I was going to talk about cybernetics, but I won't. So I'm also thinking about time, the temporality of digital systems, computational systems, the idea of memory as something that becomes linked, right? And when you have these systems that are storing and preserving, but also kind of liberating memory away from the archive. So you have this sort of technological view of memory, and then human memory, which there's all kinds of theories of human memory, right? We have Henri Bergson, and matter and memory, tons of that going on. So how do we link those two? Is it just a metaphorical link, again, that's putting these things together, or is it really producing new cultural forms, frameworks, and structures of knowledge. And then in sort of my answer to that is to sort of take off from cybernetics. And I haven't really decided if this is just a regurgitation of cybernetics or if it's moving beyond cybernetics. But I'm thinking in terms of ecology, right, and information ecology. So where both information systems and human systems are fundamentally are sort of based on interdependency, interrelationality, operating ecosystemically. So that we can not only compare informatic systems and human biological systems, but actually allow them to overlap, right? To see the way in which elements of the digital system put pressure on biological systems and so forth. So how much time do I have? 10 minutes? 15. Okay. Cool. So, some assumptions about the relationship between the traditional archive and digital stored memory certainly persist, I think. So the idea that memory, whether it is digital memory or human memory, archives, collects both personal and culturally collective past experiences. Also, that it is an aspect of consciousness specifically that enables temporal orientation and generates a sense of relationality between past, present, and future, which is also a function of the traditional archive. But the way we respond to those claims also shifts as a result of the rise of digital stored memory. So one of the effects of digital stored memory is that, as I said, everything is sort of rendered present, right? Because we can access all data, all information patterns, and make them present, make them relate with one another, sort of make them present to our experience and draw our own conclusions rather than having to think about them sort of spatially as a progression of linear time, right? So the digital stored memory system then essentially not only does away with the past, but it creates a strange relationship between the present and the future. So that companies like Goldman Sachs, for example, are trying to hire IT people or whatever that are capable of building computational systems or machines that are ever faster, right? So the speed is ever increasing and almost getting to the future, right? This is what they're trying to do. They're trying to approach the future in this kind of asymptotic way. Obviously, you never get to it because you're always in the present, but there's this future thinking, and that sort of relates to the privileging of the sort of popular privileging of new media, just in terms of its novelty, right? In terms of its newness, like this Samsung. I've been bitching about the Samsung being a better phone than my iPhone because it has all these new technological gadgets associated with it. And that sort of, newness is fetishized, in, popular culture these days. And, sort of taking a look at the traditional archive, and the digital archive allows us to see, that it's not necessarily, we haven't made an evolutionary progression between the spatial, physical archive of the past. But there are sort of resonances, right? We have to see, okay, well, memory worked in the past in this way, is there value added, or value subtracted in this new, model of the archive? Do we, still, hang on to some of the, beliefs about the need for stability of knowledge, or are we actually accepting of this, liberation of data into the giant cloud of big data, right? Do we want orientation, in the way that we had a kind of temporal orientation, within the traditional archive? I'm tying this into, and this is where I thought the two books were going to, they were going to sort of play out in two threads, but I'm weaving in nostalgia, to my thoughts, my argument, my eventual argument, in the book, because of course that's about our relationship to pastness. It's about a longing for a past that never existed. It was actually in its original, in this sort of etymological original appearance, highly pathologized. So people were said to die of nostalgia. I guess rendered, incapacitated by like the sentimentality or homesickness that would actually expire. That is no longer, that went the way of hysteria. But in terms of this sort of desire or longing for a more glorious past, results in a fantasy of the past that is also brought into the present tense, right? So that, for example, and this is an example that I've used before, the film Grease, is this nostalgic view of a 1950s that, of course, was happy, joyous, and free, and everybody sang songs, and there was no racial oppression, and no, and any of that bad stuff, and that didn't exist. But its reflection of that past, that glorious past, is not only it's sort of brought up to the present, now our past, in terms of fashion and style, and this is something that Frederick Jameson talks about a lot in his chapter on the nostalgia film. But he says that there is a nostalgic siege, which is sort of warring between bringing the past into the present, and then allowing this sort of specter of pastness to exist and the sentimentality that results from that to exist. So the question is whether digital stored memory allows for nostalgia, because it unfreezes history. It unfreezes our longing for the past, because of course it's brought into this just interconnectivity networked experience of the present. So the seeming sort of rupture that occurs, the seeming gap that occurs that allows us to long in that way and to have that emotional investment in the spectrality of the past is really foreclosed by this technological development. And that may be a good thing. It may be a bad thing. It just depends on whether we see nostalgia as useful or not useful. This is a topic that I explore in depth in a different paper. I'm not going to talk about it now. So there are my fragments. Any, questions, help that you would like to give me about this topic would be fantastic.
So I'll start with Dana, and then I'll move to you. Yeah, Dana.
Hi, that was really interesting. I'm really interested in digital technologies and the archive more as a pastime than studying, but I kind of want to return to the idea of structure of, the original archive. So we really can link that to materiality because, I mean, you have the building, you have the files, but I'm also wondering if in, the digital archive and the free-floating, if the structure is actually absent, because I'll kind of use an anecdotal example. My dad just got a Mac, and I had to explain to him what the cloud was. And I was like, well, it just, goes onto the cloud. You can access it through Wi-Fi on the internet. But he's one of those people that reads like everything in the terms of agreement. And I looked up, okay, so where's this information actually going? And there's these huge buildings down in the States that house all of this information. Well, I mean, we can't see it. They're still there. So my question is essentially, is the structure actually absent? And is there a move away from connecting free-floating information to materiality? Because, I mean, we still have chips and everything that house that information. And if there is that move away, why do you think people now don't actually think of those buildings or the chips that house the information versus actual archives where there is a huge connection to, the structure of the building and the materiality within the archive?
That's a really great question, and is also something that I've talked about somewhere else in terms of infrastructures, right? And that there are all of these collections of servers that store the information, et cetera. And yeah, I mean, there are highly, all of this is really ultimately material, right? So the fantasy of immateriality and, the floating cloud and all of that is precisely that. It's a fantasy. And there are some good, texts on that. Matthew Kirschenbaum, wrote a book called Mechanisms, and he's coming from a literary standpoint, but he's talking about, sort of media forensics, right? And so he's, looking at the sort of physiology of these media, technologies, right? And, I knew I had two. And then, Tung Wei, who his nickname, I went to grad school with him, wrote a book called, The Prehistory of the Cloud. So he is taking a media archaeological view to this and, does a really great analytic job of, tracing, connections between old metaphors and new materialities. So those are two really great places to look.
John?
Don't we? Hello, can you hear that? Don't we sort of need a digital Louvre?
A
digital Louvre, like like a museum gallery. My thought is we've been sort of lulled into this feeling that the cloud, or whatever you want to call it, is there. We can trust it, and yet the cloud is there to store all this amazing data, science, art, music, and yet the cloud is really only there to make profit. So my fear is, one is that, can we trust that? I mean more of in an ethical way. And the other thing is, isn't it more something, and I'm not saying like the Louvre or something like that is not vulnerable also, like the cloud is too, but shouldn't the state create some kind of physical presence of another way of neutrally accessing that kind of information for the future? Or there's some kind of obligation there because we look at the Dalis and so on today, and they're fabulous. We can see them. But where will that be 100 years from now, 200 years from now?
Right. I mean, there's who controls information. I mean, the man still does, really. I mean, they're collecting data about us on a daily basis every time we log on to Facebook or Amazon or whatever. You get these pop-ups. They're data mining us, essentially. And then you get issues of censorship, right? Where, there's, information that's actually withheld, through firewalls or whatever in China. So, yeah, I mean, and so that exists. And then at the same time, there is, also this fantasy of free information. And that's sort of what, the utopian, vision of the internet was, especially early on, I think, when it appeared. So yeah, the control of the flow of information is definitely an issue. I mean, in terms of the Louvre itself, thinking about art, there's a lot of work being done about how to preserve and exhibit digital art that might be on a floppy disk, or do they rebuild these like Mac 2Cs over and over again to make this artwork accessible, or is decay and obsolescence just sort of necessarily built into the art practice? And there's Christian Paul is a very famous curator who wrote a book called Curating New Media in the White Cube or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot being done on that too.
What I more meant was not actually archiving the Louvre itself, but sort of a copy of that in a digital way. Mm-hmm. And are you aware of other than the like you said, the corporations that do that for profit? Are you aware of any other sort of state-run or even philanthropist type of event to do the same? And I can't even mind boggles sort of with the bright young minds of what could be possible to carry that on. Otherwise, like I said, I think we all live in this sort of void where you kind of you leave it to someone else to preserve this. So yeah.
I mean, I think maybe we'll talk a little bit after about digitization and digital archives and stuff like that. So, yeah, we can definitely talk after.
I'll take Charo's question.
Answer your question, John. The Met recently released a bunch of images to the public domain, which is an interesting thing to think about, like all of these photographs and how we might view them. But they're publicly accessible for people to use now, and more public art galleries are doing that. It's kind of imperative to have an online presence that where you can show your permanent collection and that kind of thing. It's a different kind of experience, obviously. You're not experiencing the work of art firsthand, but it's that idea of the commons, again, where it is then publicly accessible.
Thanks. I'll go for Marlo next.
I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on the restructuring of how the data is organized. Mm-hmm. So in a traditional library, I would go in and look up, for instance, a young adult section for books if I wanted to read something, or science, or religion. But my experience with the internet is that it's much more question-based, and it's more that all the information you possibly ever want is already there, but it's all a matter of what questions you ask. And I found that it seems to be, in many cases, and I've fallen victim to this, it seems to be creating a bit of a feedback loop in terms of my knowledge, in that I create I create a bias, and I find topics that enforce that bias. Mm-hmm. The way I thought of it at the time was like soccer mom research, where I don't believe in vaccines, so I search up vaccines are bad on Google, and I find articles relating to vaccines are bad, and then therefore I believe vaccines are bad. Yeah. I was curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic observation, and one that I haven't really thought about. But yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely yeah, I think that's probably true. There's something else I was going to say to that. Oh, right. The question of how the information is organized, or how data is organized. There's all kinds of different systems that are developing, and I can't think of the particular company or project, but they're organizing information according to like color, right? So it's no longer a sort of language-based system, but it's a perceptual system. And why they're doing this, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I mean, there's also the notion that there is, of course, no raw data. So yes, you're reinforcing your own beliefs by sort of self-reflexively asking these questions. And that really sort of proves out that we think of data points as being this, sort of collected and then out there for whatever recombinatory use. But when you turn data into information, it's always, and there is no data that isn't subject to interpretation, right? That doesn't go in some sort of hypothetical direction. So I think that's a terrific example of that. And there are other different kinds of ways you could describe it, but yeah, data is always cooked, never raw. It's always cooked.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's one thing when you're sort of self-directing and self-censoring, as you say, but then of course Google will tailor your results to your particular search query, right? That's what you were referring
it'll
to.
tailor it as well to certain advertising goals as well.
Yeah, and if I log in and I search for art 20th century on my phone, I get very different results if I log in and do that on a public computer, for example, because Google knows what I like.
Or what search engine you use, for instance.
Yeah. Okay, so we had the glasses now.
Yeah, so in the middle of winter on a rainy day on Hornby, a friend sends me a little link on Facebook. And it's the Museum of Modern Art from New York has got all its paintings on my computer. And I sit on Hornby and the rain's coming in, my cat's on my lap, and I go through a stroll through a place that I'll never go except through cyberspace. Mm-hmm. So, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, there's the digitization of cultural artifacts and art and everything like this is really terrific in one way. I mean, when I was working on putting together the images for my book and panicking about image permissions, because of course we have to pay for them. Like our universities don't pay for our image permissions, and I've known people who have paid thousands to get image permissions. And a bunch of my images were, in what's the word? In the commons, basically. I could just use them freely. So that's great, right? It's the availability of an increasing amount of information that's stored digitally. The problem with that, of course, is that the traditional art historian, or I would say that, of course, you're going to have a very different experience of the art. If it's, painting or something, it's going to be a very different experience than seeing it on your screen versus an artwork that was made for a screen specifically, right? So there's kind of medium questions about medium specificity and so forth that arise from that. Yeah.
The gentleman over there. Microphone.
I should point out the profit-rooted basis of the structuring of information searches in digital archiving places serious tensions on various questions in epistemology. What is it that we know? What is it that we can know? What does it mean to know? Additionally, the very emergence of digital archiving imposes radical tensions on certain formative questions of art history, of aesthetics. For example, the issue of what is the artwork? Is it the material object that the artist works, or is it the audience's experience of the material object? Now, the answer to that question gets seriously biased by the existence of digital archiving. If the Louvre or the Met archives all of their collection on the cloud, has their collection been archived on the cloud? Or is it only representations of the collection that are more or less correspond to the actual works of art? And when you make a work of art, when an artist works, some artists have been very happy shifting to working on their iPads instead of working on canvas. Some artists still feel that it's necessary, in order for them to do art, to work with material, with matter. Jeffrey's work could not have been created digitally. Even if you could create three-dimensional holographic representations of the sculptures, project them right here in the middle of the room, turn around, let's look at them. Even if, I forget what the term is, you can have tactile representations, and with your gloves you can touch the holograph. That's not the work of art. And if he could have created directly those holographic representations of the sculptures with his gloves, instead of with the chemicals in his barn, would he have created the same artworks? Now, art has been an engagement of the soul through the hand with the material world, always. As it becomes digitized, is art being destroyed?
Can I respond? That was great. I would respond to that by saying that art is always going to be a great debate. Art is always a technology, right? I mean, if you think about Renaissance painting, it is structured using, Albertian perspective, right? The very kind of architectonics of the painting, of the depiction, are dependent on this kind of paradigmatic technological worldview, right? And then even, I was so fascinated to learn about Jeffrey Rubinoff's work that he began to use a computer to sort of project the degree to which something would reflect off of the surface of the metal, right? And his intense his movement towards a sort of intense infinitesimal measurement, which to me is reflective of what's called the sort of computational turn or the datalogical turn, depending on what school you're using, that we are so suffused by computational technology that yes, the materiality is absolutely key, right? I mean, he's using the computer to think about how light and this particular material are going to interact. So it's not virtualized in any way, but there's this idea of sort of the post-digital, where in which we are that this technology has become so much second nature to us that everything is processed through computation in some way. The way that we think about brain function or anything, right, is shot through with our our dependency upon, sort of paradigms about technology and computational technology.
Thanks. Great question. So I have Catherine, Sam, Charo, then Astara. Then I'll move on. Yeah. So Catherine.
Thank you so much. I actually wanted maybe didn't go into it in the paper, but I almost wanted to go back to cybernetics just a little bit. And just as you were talking and the conversation as it's kind of developed, just made me think of a couple of things I've read recently, kind of looking back to Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto and kind of interrogating some of that earlier discussion, but also maybe looking back to it in a slightly nostalgic way for a moment when there was this kind of cyborg figure who could fuse kind of Marxist, feminist, queer potentialities, and that now seeming outmoded, that kind of earlier, more utopian moment. And yeah, so it's a very simple question really about whether your kind of current project, where you might see your current project intersecting with those kinds of debates, if you do, and whether you see this kind of archival subject, this archival drag, as a kind of contribution to that cyborg thinking, or kind of a way of reframing some of that earlier. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, not specifically the cyborg. I wouldn't go into that trope exactly, but as we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and my work is always completely rooted in thinking about cybernetics and the cultural influences and the technological influences, and how all of the sort of the rise of the information age. And I'm fascinated with that aspect in conceptual art, right? The Benjamin Buchlo's aesthetic of administration, or all of these ways that artists and theorists and critics and historians are beginning to think through this work in terms of informatic quantities, right, or messages. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely going to play into the current work. I have it sort of charted out. Here I'm talking about cybernetics, and I don't remember where exactly that is, but yeah, it's always there.
Sam?
So I know that in your book you take up the question of kind of computation, advent of a computational worldview, but also various artistic practices that seem to engage with it and work through its possibilities or permutations, or whatever you want to call it. I just wondered if you see any current art practices doing similar things with the kind of issues you're engaging now, and maybe even if not, why not? Like what it is about these issues that might resist the ability for artists to engage them interestingly.
Right. Yes. Short answer. One of my very favorite artists who does appear in my book is Jim Campbell, and he made a series called Home Movies, in which he collected found footage of home movies from 1950s, circa mid-century, right? Forgotten, left in attics. Just, ephemera. And he utilized these sort of LED not screens, but veils that are actually strings of LED lights, and sort of uses those to project this image, which is accessible or legible perceptually to varying degrees, depending on the actual piece. And then, of course, the film, sort of the ontology of the film, is called into question, right? But then there's also this there is a reconsideration of nostalgia, in that moment, because you have the collision of highly contemporary digital technology with these with these films that would create probably intense resonances with a certain generation, and different kinds of resonances with younger generations, but that represent the American dream, right? That represent this past that really did never exist in the fullness of its utopianism. So in that sense, I mean, so memory there is being dealt with, and then the translation of memory into a computational system and how that affects legibility and aesthetics and so on. So that's just one example. Probably don't want to go on and on, but yeah.
Jared?
Is this on? Yeah? Two different thoughts just to follow up on what Jerry was talking about. I don't think that any of us in this room would argue that against the authenticity of the experience of an art object, that experiencing the actual materiality of an art object in person is completely different than Janet looking on her computer screen in the dead of winter at these images, which is more akin to like looking at a book, right? But Carol and I were actually just talking about the experience of the observatory, and when Craig and I were there a few years ago with his young nieces, we witnessed that they weren't experiencing the same sense of awe as we were, because I think that they kind of thought what they were seeing was a projection or like a recording or, like an image of the planets. Whereas when we were looking through the telescope, we were really experiencing that sense of like, we're really looking at this very moment, this planet and what it's doing. So that's sort of one thought, but also back to your, you raised image permissions and this idea of making these images available. I work in an art gallery, and so for our permanent collection, when we bring a new work into the collection, we have artists sign an agreement, a copyright agreement about image use. And there's all sorts of rules around, like we are legally allowed to use an image from an artist if it's 50 years old. Otherwise, we have to have their permission. I'm just wondering, with your research around ownership, this comes up a lot around music now, right? And royalties and all that kind of stuff, around who owns the rights to this.
Mm-hmm. Even if a project is technically labeled within the Creative Commons, which is Lawrence Lessig's creation, so it's sort of supposed to be freely available, even though it's contemporary. The protocol is still to always identify the artist, even if it's a collective. Always communicate with them, get rights from them. But what's interesting is that I, as opposed to basically everybody that I know, didn't have to spend a dime on image permissions, because the artists who are working now, and the pieces that I'm showing, it's not that they don't think in terms of ownership, because of course I am asking them for permission, but, and there may be also the element that being in a book, gets their name out, but, there's still some sort of change in the idea that things should be more freely circulated. Even I was not expecting that all the artists would give me permissions, without paying them. But I just want to go back just very quickly to your first point, because I think this is such an interesting reversal of the argument that I'm making, right? Which is that a younger generation would assume that that it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a projection of something preserved from the past, but that everything is unfolding in real time, right? So that when we FaceTime or we communicate in various ways, it's always very much in the present. And there's this assumption that things unfold in real time, and there's frustration if the internet doesn't work and if it's slow and all this stuff. So yeah, I was surprised by that. I will just end that. Yeah.
That was my experience, by the way. I was sort of thinking, am I just looking at a JPEG or am I looking at a real thing? And I think Catherine pointed out, all experience now is mediatized in a sense, right? I mean, we see it through the filter of Facebook, even if it's #no filter on it, right? So, Astara, I'll move to you.
So my question is kind of going back to, which you've touched on these ideas like in other questions and in your responses, but I was really struck by kind of this tension that you presented between human and digital memory. What struck me as kind of a tension, and also you're talking about kind of the power of the digital archive, which also seemed really kind of interesting for me, especially in terms of thinking about how dependent we become on digital systems and, searching things through Google and Wikipedia and that kind of thing. So I guess part of my question is just how you might see, or if you would say that maybe digital systems are impacting or changing, kind of shaping human knowledge and memory, the way that we are perceiving things. And then you mentioned also kind of this fetishizing of newness. So I'm also curious, is there any sort of kind of potential, even though there's so much more information now from the past that's accessible digitally, is there sort of this danger that we might lose touch of that, kind of connection to the past and to history?
Yeah. Let's see, which one do I want to start? So yes, I actually, when I was planning on reading this paper, I have a line in there about how, memory as a physiological, neurological thing, right, a phenomenon, is actually being restructured by these technologies. So you have, attenuating attention spans. There's been research done on this, and the long-term memory is going out the window. We store our knowledge, our memory, our brains on the internet, essentially. I mean, I was thinking, in my own experience about how I used to be able to navigate cities. I would start with a paper map, and then I would just figure it out. I had this kind of spatial awareness and orientation that, allowed me to navigate it, without GPS. And now, I go to the same person's house 5 times, and I still don't remember how to get there because I'm still relying on my damn phone. And in my teaching, right, I had a conversation once with someone that said, oh, don't worry about, hard facts or dates or something like that, because they could just Google that. So it's all, all of that kind of knowledge is just stored elsewhere. So yeah, I think there is definitely an impact. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've hit lunch hours. So, thank you very much, Meredith, for this stimulating talk. And I hope we've also given you material to, to develop it further. So, come again? Let's go and look at the pictures online. Yeah. So, thanks a lot.